Hi everybody, welcome. My name is Leah. My channel is Common Sense Ethics. I'm really excited about my guest today. His name is Brennan Malone. I'd like to invite you, Brennan, to tell us a little bit about yourself and your channel and anything else you want us to know.
Well, first of all, Leah, thanks for having me on. It's really it's a real privilege to be here. I have been on YouTube for a while. Those who watch my channel, Left Foot Media, will probably be familiar with my style and approach. I talk about predominantly about film and television, but really I'm a lot more interested in the bigger issues that mythology and storytelling really raises about the human experience and about life and about ethics. I run my own charitable organization, and I specialize in the area of bioethics, actually. And so some of the big issues, really, they're the big ethical issues, and I do a lot of traveling and speaking in that space. So for me, on my YouTube channel, I guess it's a way of trying to talk about those issues, but really I think through the medium of storytelling I think because you think about when you go and see a film, you are commonly engaging with those big ethical questions in a lot of films now. So it's a really common thing. And so it's a great way to actually have that conversation and have that discussion.
Yeah. And I started watching your channel because of the Star Wars content.
A lot of people did.
Yeah, but then as I listened to it more, I realized that, you know, you and I are interested in a lot of the same things, like in promoting sort of, reasonable dialogue, in a civilized way, and with virtue and ethics, and which is why I invited you to come on today. So what we're going to be talking about is media and journalistic ethics. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about your background. I know with your line of work, you're involved in, journalism. And, well, you can just go ahead and answer that part first, and then we'll get to the part about journalistic ethics.
Well, for me, I've had direct involvement with the media for over 16 years now here in my country, and also in Australia. I do quite a bit of work there as well. And that work, initially, I was a media spokesperson for an organization, and so I was regularly appearing in the media, preparing press releases, working with, sometimes we'd bring guests into the country for conferences, and I would sort of media manage them and things like that. And now a lot of my work, really for the last 10 years plus, has been, I'm not on the front line anymore as much. I now do media training, though, for organizations and for individuals, and media consultancy, and helping them engage with or prepare for interviews or run campaigns and things like that. And so I've seen the media up close and personal, and also I have seen the change in the media. It's a lot of people possibly wouldn't appreciate the fact that the media, when I first started, was not at all what it is now, and the way in which not just the technology but the nature of, I would argue, journalism and how some of those problems have really manifested and got a lot worse over that period.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. So you can tell us a little bit about when you started working, and hopefully probably still today, what how you would define sort of traditional journalistic ethics, and then we can talk a little bit about how that may have changed.
Yeah, well, I think basically, if you think about journalism, what's it really all about? I think it's really about inquiry. Yeah. And I think good journalism ultimately is about inquiry about the important things. It's not trivial stuff. It's not you have the puff pieces, right? The cat that got stuck up a tree and the fireman had to come and rescue it. But most of the time, it's inquiring about the important stuff. It's about helping, ultimately, I think, to increase knowledge and awareness and to lead people deeper to the truth. I think that's what good journalism is about. Now, to do that well and to be a good journalist, I think you have to have the fundamentals of journalistic ethics around objectivity. None of us is truly bias free. That's just it's just, you can't be bias free. But having the virtue to be able to say, in my role, in my job, what I've got to do is I've actually got to put aside my own bias and not interfere with this person I'm interviewing or the story I'm telling, and as much as possible. And also then I think integrity and honesty are essential as well. If you're telling the truth, you've got to have those things.
Yeah.
And I think really good journalism, it's more essential, I think, now than ever before, really, because traditionally you didn't really, if you think about human history, for most of human history, we didn't need journalism. We just didn't need it because we didn't live in a democracy where we have to vote and elect our own leaders. And it was just decided for us. Some king was anointed or appointed because they were born into the right family, and you didn't have much say in the matter. It's only very recent when you think about the fact that the majority have the opportunity to choose their own leaders. And what that means is more than ever before, we need the fourth estate, as Edmund Burke would call it. Yes. We need the fourth estate to be truthful, to be reliable, and to be informing us about stuff that really matters in a way that's unbiased. Yeah, and that leads right into my next question, which is, and you sort of already have said this, but so do you think that more objective or nonpartisan journalism is in decline? Yeah, I do, and it's a problem. I think there's so much tribalism out there now, you see, and it exists in the journalistic space as well. And look, there's a certain part of me that says if outfits are up front about where their politics are or their partisanship, so they say, look, this is where we sit philosophically, we're conservative, or we lean to the left, or whatever it is, if they're up front and they're constantly up front about that, you can live with that, I think, as long as they give equal airtime to all sides. Yeah. But that's not what's happening. I saw a survey from the last election, I think it was actually in America, believe it or not. And it was Fox News apparently came out as the most objective. And what they meant by that was they said that they definitely wore their stripes on their sleeves, that you knew where they stood, but they gave equal time to all sides of the political spectrum, whereas other channels didn't do that. And I think that's the key component that you need. But there is a real problem with tribalism, and also the way in which that is now dictating the shaping of stories and the telling of facts. Yeah, so I was going to ask you, to what extent do you think that nonpartisan or unbiased news can exist? Like, how unbiased can you possibly be? I think it's possible. I absolutely think it's possible. But I think what we're seeing here is a manifestation of a bigger problem. Yeah. And I've been talking about this for a while. The West, as we know it today, is inextricably linked to the Christian origins of the modern West. And now, what I mean by that is you don't have to be a Christian to have what you might call the traditional Christian mindset about the world. Yeah. But the reason you have that mindset, as one atheist commentator put it in a book he wrote a couple of years ago, even if you're an atheist, if you live in the West, you dream Christian dreams, even if you don't realize that. And so the point is that subconsciously we've imbued all the stuff that really matters, the Sermon on the Mount, the idea of humility, the idea that all people are morally equal. These are profound ideas that come into the ancient world through Christianity, and they're with us today. Now, what we've got today in the West, the modern West, is not just a loss of that and that cultural identity, but an open hostility and an attempt to try and break it down, to attack tradition as something bad and oppressive and everything else. Now, that is manifesting itself all over the place, and including in journalism. Yeah. And I would argue that's a big factor here. So what you've got is journalists who, it seems pretty clear to me, the virtue of humility, for example, is not prized. Yeah. Whereas you go back, say, 60, 70 years ago, and everyone understood it. Didn't matter what your religious beliefs were in the West. You just understood that it wasn't a good thing to have journalists who lacked humility, or anyone who lacked humility. Now we just sort of, the ego and arrogance and everything is almost prized in places. I watched an interview here, a media interview here, just after our elections. We had our elections 2 weeks ago, and a journalist conducted, it's only about 4 minutes long, but it was one of the most atrocious pieces of media I've seen. She was hostile. It was a guy I didn't vote for, and I would never vote for, and he had some big character flaws, but it was atrocious. She just attacked him, called him names in this interview, And people, what I couldn't believe was the number of people who were cheering that on and saying, this was great, she really showed him. And you can see how that breakdown in how we think we should conduct ourselves in an ethical way is affecting journalism as well, I think, in a big way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to touch on humility, and I was going to come back to that later. But I tried to look for some harder like data about sort of bias in media, and I did find, now this is out of the United States, but there was a study out of Texas A&M that showed that they surveyed like I think financial journalists. And out of those surveyed, it said that only 4% reported themselves as being to the right of center. The rest reported themselves as being moderate, and the majority reported being left of center. Now, like you say, this isn't necessarily a problem if people can be unbiased, right? But if they can't separate their bias from their reporting, then it's much better for there to be a spectrum of journalists with more heterodox views, so but so like you said, I mean, maybe it's okay if there is journalistic bias as long as that whatever media outlet is upfront about it, but I don't really see that happening. So no, I think the ideal still too is for objectivity. Yeah. And to actually to be able to say, look, these are my personal political feelings, but I'm not here to tell you my personal political feelings. I'm here to report on the important facts about the important issues in the most objective way I possibly can. That's my job. And I think that's what journalists and editors should be aiming for. Yeah, absolutely. Well, So you can comment on to what extent this is happening in New Zealand too, but the example that I cherry picked is American. But I completely agree that it seems like outlets are becoming more partisan. And a good example of this was that there was a former New York Times editor who I guess last year, her name is Jill Abramson. I'll link to other sources that I use in the description, but she said that her opinion was that the Times had basically adopted an anti-Trump bias in its straight news reporting, so not in opinions, in the opinion pieces about, so basically really anti-Trump in their straight journalism for financial gain. Now, this is a big problem because the New York Times is or was considered, the premier newspaper.
The gray lady.
Yeah.
Right? Yep.
In the country. Now, I don't know. You could make an argument that maybe that's not quite true anymore. But do you see this happening there in New Zealand as well? Just things becoming more sort of partisan?
Oh, absolutely. And it's the same problem. Like you mentioned this previously about surveys around where journalists sit on the political spectrum. And I think that's a factor. And there's also some other complexities that come into this as well. But the same thing is global now, around, particularly in the West. Yeah. As you see consistently, the vast majority of people in the journalistic trade are left-leaning. And there's an issue there. Yeah. Because, like you say, you get into an echo chamber and you think because everyone around you seems to be talking the same language and looking at the world the same way. You think that's what normal's supposed to be. And so that's the first problem. Second problem is, I think, to sort of compound the problem is a lot of people now wrongly believe that their view of the world is the center. So if you're in a community of people who lean left, and you believe as a journalist that your view of the world is the center, basically how it really should be, then you're going to look at anyone who's to the right of you. So that would be someone in the center. Yeah. You're going to look at them as hard right. You're going to think, man, they're an extremist. Yeah. You're not going to, and you're going to look at people who are slightly left of you, and you're going to go, oh yeah, they're slightly left of me. You're not going to realize that in actual fact they're way out here. So your view of the Overton window is distorted, that's for sure. And then I think also on top of that, we've now got a school of journalists who have been for far too long have been schooled to believe that their job is to change the world, basically, that they are effectively, that they're supposed to be activists of some kind, and that they are responsible for shaping and making a brighter and better new world. Now, yes, journalism can absolutely contribute to that, and when it's done well, for sure. But there's a difference between that happening because you've got good journalism happening and people actively trying to pursue that as their sort of goal that they're there to make the world better. Because very quickly what happens is you start to believe, as I said, that your whole reporting has got to be coloured by building the world that you think is the better world.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, it has to be self-reinforcing when everybody, that you're interacting with thinks pretty much the same thing as you. We saw evidence of that when Trump won in 2016, and almost all the journalists were so shocked, and it's because they were so out of touch with, I guess, what the country was thinking, that they just couldn't even believe that happened.
Well, I think too, it's that's a great example of where you've got a group of people who probably all dwell together. They're probably inner city apartment urban dwellers, sort of by nature. That they don't understand what the working class are going through. It's a very look. I've moved in those circles. I've never really lived in those circles. I grew up in a very poor family, but I've moved of late in those circles with different campaigns and things I've been involved in, and I get the appeal of it, and I can understand how you live. You might work in a building and then travel across town, or maybe even just a couple of blocks away to where you live. You eat in that area, you socialize. It's a very different world when you're sort of in that world. And so there's no doubt that's a factor. And one thing I think that the Trump election win last time has really exposed, it doesn't matter what you think of Trump, there's no doubting that he has exposed just how corrupt and biased the media is willing to be now, and how many of these issues, that they believe really they're fighting a war against tyranny, and it's frightening because that for journalists, that's not where they should be. Yeah,
absolutely. And like you say, it has exposed definitely, sort of just how glaring the problem is with sort of bias and lack of integrity in media. I mean, I was critical of media before Trump was even elected, but I mean, now it's kind of a chicken or an egg problem. It's like, well, I mean, it's not just because of Trump, as you say, but it's like now it's like, well, which came which came first? Yeah, exactly.
And I would say too that this has been an issue well before Trump. All Trump did was expose in a big way and show just how willing to be partisan and to how extreme they'll actually go. Look, in my media training, I have been telling people now, and here, New Zealand's got nothing to do with Trump, completely different part of the world, completely different environment, but I've been telling people in my media training sessions for a couple of years now, do not trust a journalist. Unless you know that person, excuse me, as a friend, do not trust a journalist. The moment that they ring you and introduce themselves as a journalist is the moment you've got to assume that you're on the record and they are working you and working an angle, and you don't know what that angle is. Now, it never used to be that way. But look, I've seen things that people would be absolutely shocked by. I've seen editors who have had previous relationships with people that they've worked with and they've worked closely with try and trick those people who the person thought they had a friendship, a basic sort of working friendship with this person, and they've tried to actually trick them for their own journalistic advantage. So I've seen so many violations of basic journalistic ethics now that and that's got nothing to do with Trump. It's in New Zealand. It's all over the world. This is a problem, and I think a big factor here, something we haven't talked about so far, is that I don't think journalism and media reacted well and responded well and shifted with the change to more internet-based information sharing. They didn't figure out at first. I remember when it happened and everyone started blogging. And remember when blogging was the big thing and there was this claim that blogging was going to replace journalism and they would be the new journalists. But what the media never quite got their head around was they never realized that all bloggers were doing was they were taking content that journalists were producing and then replicating it and commenting on it. And so they bought the myth that they had to change. And so what they did was a big problem was they didn't put their content behind a paywall. And so what happened was a lot of media outlets suffered financially. They lost staff, and then they bought into the social media model where you've got to have constant, fresh stories. So now you've got this vicious circle where you've got newsrooms with less staff
Yeah.
They've got tighter deadlines. Once upon a time, a journalistic deadline used to be 12 or 24 hours, depending on how often you produced a main edition or a paper. Now it's just constant.
Yeah.
The news cycle is constant. And so you've got to tune out lots of content. So you've got less staff. They've got to tune out more content, tighter deadlines.
Yeah.
And you can see how that destroys even basic fact-checking and basic investigation. And what does it do? Because they want you to click on their stories.
Yeah.
As one expert in Silicon Valley said, social media is about a race to the bottom of the brainstem. So what they want, like they don't want you thinking on social media. They want your animal brain clicking, click, click, click.
Yeah.
So what you see is you get salacious gossip type stories. I'll give you an example. Here in New Zealand, a major newspaper, their online version just a couple of weeks ago ran a story about a woman who confessed anonymously in a Reddit thread that she had breastfed her next door neighbour's child. That was the story. And our main news, they're not a tabloid, but they ran that anonymous from Reddit, no fact checking, no source verification. That could have been a complete fabrication, and it's not even close to being newsworthy. But they run that because they know people will click on it, and that drives their revenue. So all of that has just created an absolute toxic mess within journalism. It's crazy when you think about that story. And that's not the worst of them either. Out that same newspaper about 2 or 3 years ago ran a story which was an absolute forgery about supposedly a preacher in Africa had told his congregation that he could, I think he was trying to prove he could walk on water like Jesus. This was the story, and he got eaten by a crocodile. It was like an internet hoax. It was a lie. There was nothing. There was no story. There was no preacher. Our biggest major daily ran that story and then just quietly retracted.
Well, at least they retracted it.
Now it's a 404 broken link, but that was insane. And which, by the way, I think that brings to another issue. I think that we need to I think grapple with around journalism, and that's the whole, because now so much journalism is online.
Yeah,
you can actually get away with promoting a false version of events and then going back and changing it, and no one knows. And you're not held accountable. I'm a firm believer that what needs to happen now is that all online media, every time they change a story, I believe that there has to be some sort of edit notification at the top. I think this should be standard. So that if you go and read a story, you can see how often they've edited this story and what they've changed. And if you could see that, you'd start to pretty quickly get a sense for which journalistic outfits, which media organizations are reliable and which ones rush half-truths out into the media and then have to change and retract things.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. You keep anticipating all of my next questions. So,
sorry.
No, that's all right. Let's skip ahead then. So I was going to ask you, and you sort of already spoke to this, why, because you said that deadlines have been sped up, right? Editorial deadlines. So it says here that, I was going to ask, why does reporting lack nuance? Like a lot of times you'll feel like you'll be really interested in some kind of story or topic, and you'll read one article and there's a lot of stuff that's you're wondering, and why is this not in here? You'll have to search for a bunch of different sources for that. So yeah, you sort of already answered that, but I was wondering, is it laziness and not fact checking, or is it sort of a clickbaity phenomenon where they have to, compete, with online media and so on? But you sort of already touched on that.
I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
And so you where you see the rushing problem in a big way is online print media. Yeah. And the stories now consistently appear with pretty simple grammatical and spelling errors into them, in them, and including sometimes in headlines. And it's just insane. That's someone rushing. Yeah. And so that's trying to put out lots of content. Then of course there's the clickbait angle. Yeah. And then the third factor is bias. Yeah. And I've seen stories where they, in journalism they talk about burying the lead, and what they mean is the headline says one thing, but then you get right. 2/3 of the way through the story, then you read the most important sentence that completely changes the actual nature of what you're reading. And the problem is this, that most people today, they don't even click on a story. They read a headline and they assume they've got all the information they need from that headline, let alone reading the whole story and finding out. But all of that, as I said, I think there's those three factors: the bias, there's the pressure that's on journalists, and then there's the clickbaity nature of the way things now are crafted to try and get you to click on it.
No, that's a good answer. And I'm gonna come back to talking about retractions and stuff in a second. But okay, so there was a 2019 Gallup poll here in the U.S. that said that only 41% of Americans have a great deal of trust in media. In 1972, a similar Gallup poll said 68% of Americans had a great deal of trust in media, and I bet if they did it this year, it would probably be even lower. But so why do you think that is? Probably for all the reasons we've discussed and others, but what do you think?
Well, it's just journalism is not a trustworthy profession anymore. It's just not. And I know I've got friends who are journalists who actually are good journalists, and it really pains them. And I know I've got another friend of mine who likes to say, oh, look, it's not, journalism's not really that bad. And it's like, it's very hard to recognize when you're in something how bad it's got. We have a survey in New Zealand, actually, that they survey people about 10 public professions, and journalism's one of them. Journalism now consistently ranks as the least trusted of those 10. They're below lawyers in New Zealand for trustworthiness. Now, that's astounding. But that has happened because journalism has made itself untrustworthy. It is that, like I said, I never used to tell people in media training, don't trust the media. I always used to say, keep your guard up, because you have to be wary. Too many people would get in front of a camera and they would think they were off the record, and they would, they just wouldn't keep their guard up. The journalist has got a job to do, and rightly so. If they're trying to probe for information and you're not smart enough and you just give them all the information that you shouldn't be giving them, well, they're going to run with the story.
Yeah.
But I've never before have I had to tell people until the last couple of years, don't trust the journalist. And I've had situations where one person I was working with, they came to me after the fact. So they had a media engagement where they were set up. They run a counselling service, and a media organisation here in New Zealand. They sent in a client who was a fake client, and then they filmed it secretly. And then what they did was they rang up this organisation and they said, would you like to go on the record? They told them what they'd done, and they said, would you like to go on the record? And this, very smartly, the person in charge of this organisation said, no, thank you. We decline that. We're not interested. Yeah. And that's a great tip, by the way, that one of the worst things you can do often is give a story oxygen in the media. And a lot of people don't realise that. They think, I've got to comment. Actually, if you don't have to, don't. And the story will die a lot quicker. So they wisely didn't do that. But here's the thing. What that journalist was doing the whole time is they're on the phone with this person and they're saying, are you willing to go on the record? Now, journalistic ethics, that means you're not on the record at that point. Well, in actual fact, they were. Yeah. They were recording the conversation, and they had a camera in the studio on the journalist, and they used it in the broadcast. That is unbelievable. Like, the person has actually, you've got them on camera saying they don't want to go on the record, and you're using that, even though they said no permission to go on the record. Like, it's just, that's a really basic violation of ethics. And that tells you that there's a real trustworthiness problem for journalism, and it's created that problem for itself. And I think a big factor too is that we've allowed too much of the celebrity journalist as well. I think this editorializing was always a risk, but now it's become a real problem. And we've got celebrity journalists who believe their own press. It's all about their brand and creating their brand, and they really, I think a lot of them now believe that they are more important than the story. They are the truth tellers of society and all this kind of nonsense. And there's that lack of humility we were talking about before.
Yeah, I'll get back to that in a second. But, okay, so I know that you covered this story on your channel, but last year there was the whole Covington Catholic kids incident here in the U.S., and that really, it's probably the most widely known example that I could think of to use, but there's a couple others that I could bring up, which I may. But, so for anyone who doesn't know the details of the story, there were a bunch of Catholic high school students at, I guess it was the March for Life, and a picture emerged on Twitter in which one of the kids was perceived to be smugly smiling at this Native American elder, right? And so This kid.
And the picture looked bad, right?
Yeah, it looked really bad. Yeah. So he was subject to a 2-minute hate on Twitter.
Good old Twitter.
And, and all these media outlets really ran with this story. And like you said, there wasn't any fact-checking done. And basically, it later came out through a separate video that this guy, this Native American gentleman, had actually come up to them, unprovoked, and that they had basically done nothing. And they even had, I think a couple places even had this guy on TV, and, he gave a false account. It turned out that he was a known charlatan. He'd lied about a bunch of other things. But so anyway, by this point, at least Nick Sandman was the one who was really defamed, right, in this whole incident. Yep. And he ended up suing CNN and the Washington Post and a couple other places. I believe some of them have not been settled yet. I think Rolling Stone, I think New York Times. I'm trying to represent this as accurately as possible. So he recently, I guess this year, so his reputation was destroyed, basically. Like, if that's you, and, you have the media piling on you, and, people are saying, oh, he should be punched, he should be, all these things, and here, he's a 17-year-old kid. What's going to happen when he goes to apply for college? It's like everyone's going to know who he is, so it's basically like, he basically, his life is destroyed if people remember this, going into the future. He's just a regular person. He doesn't have all these defenders. So he sued. And, he settled, he alleged that he was libeled, and I believe he settled with the Washington Post, out of court. And they never retracted this, by the way. I think his lawyer gave them several opportunities to retract the story, or, and they didn't do it satisfactorily, which is why he ended up, winning this lawsuit, or, well, at least to the point where he settled with them. So I just cannot wrap, okay, so all the things we've talked about so far are in play here. First of all, there was this lazy sort of, agenda-driven thing. Here are these Catholic kids at the Right to Life. Look at this, minority man is being accosted by them and all this stuff. So there's this agenda here which turns out to be utterly false, right? But when it's shown, and there was no fact-checking, the story went out for, the Twitter mob condemned this person, and the media just ran with it. And then once they realized it was inaccurate, some places still did not satisfactorily redact this story, to the point that they would rather pay millions of dollars, right, in some lawsuit, than just set the record straight. I just can't even get my mind around that. Like, it doesn't make sense from any angle, right?
No. There's, and it's a funny thing, that incident, like you say, it encompasses so much of what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And there was an element of rushing to judgment. The interesting thing about that was it's what they wanted to believe as well. It had everything that they thought. If you're someone who is in that part of the political spectrum, he was the boogeyman in every way. He's a white guy wearing a red hat up against a Native American Indian man, and you think oppression. And so that's how you interpret it. You don't fact check, you rush, and then you continue to lie. Yeah. Even when you've been caught in the lie.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I've got a friend who's a journalist here in New Zealand with a bit of experience. And one of the things that he said to me a few years ago, which was fascinating as an insight from someone inside the industry, was he said one thing that journalists really hate and media organizations hate, believe it or not, more than bias, is actually people thinking that they are biased. So possibly they held their ground because they thought, if we admit that we were biased, that's worse than fighting this and pretending that we weren't biased, because to admit that you were biased, it's just, that's horrific for them. So, possibly that's what drove it, or possibly they're just so ideologically committed that they weren't willing to bend. It is astounding, absolutely astounding.
Yeah, especially since, it's a contracting, profession, economically speaking. Like, why would they want to have to pay out money that they don't need to pay out? But I think, several of the lawsuits are still going on. So,
and I think I'm pleased to hear about the wins that he's had, because I remember that incident as it unfolded, and that thing went global.
Yeah.
That thing absolutely went global, and they destroyed his reputation. And it wasn't just that they destroyed his reputation. You had adult journalists and media celebrities who were effectively wishing ill will on him, who were speaking hatefully about him. It was just a disgraceful, it just showed a complete lack of virtue. Now, even if all of that stuff had turned out to be true, if he'd wandered up to someone like that and he just stared at him, even that, did that warrant that kind of reaction? If we're supposed to be better than that, quote unquote, that thing that didn't happen, why would we conduct ourselves that way? We wouldn't. We wouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. That incident is just crazy. And there was another thing that happened which was really awful, and it was in the UK, so you may not be aware of it. So Roger Scruton is I would say he's really well known in the UK, maybe not so much here. But yeah, he's a public philosopher, so to speak, and he had a long and illustrious career. I think he published over 40 books, and he'd been nominated to some not very important government committee in England on architecture, and this is another kind of thing, like you say, where you feel like someone might have felt like they had a sort of a relationship with a journalistic outlet and they trusted them. And so I believe that he granted an interview with a journalist named George Eaton from the New Statesman, and because he had been the wine critic at the New Statesman for a while, and so he sort of had a relationship with this outlet. And so the journalist came over to his house and asked him a bunch of really leading questions, which I don't think he really didn't seem to take the bait. Although he was trying to get him to say a lot of really controversial things, right, this journalist. At least this is what came out later when the tape was released. But anyway, so the George Eaton, the journalist, went ahead and published this interview, but not the tape of it. And he alleged that Roger Scruton had said all these, controversial things. And before any of this had even been fact-checked or anything, he was ousted from his nominal government position. And so for weeks, there was this other journalist, Douglas Murray, who was saying, release the tape. We don't believe that what you're telling us is accurate. And so that went on for a couple of weeks. And then finally, he got a copy of the tape somehow. I don't think anyone really knows how. But it turned out that Scruton, I don't know how that happened, had been...
That's right. See no evil, hear no evil.
I have no idea. I would like to know, but I'm sure I never will. But... yeah, so he had been just completely lied about and misrepresented, and he ended up getting his job back, on this government committee. But it turned out that the guy had completely lied, and that he was demoted, but I believe he's still at the New Statesman. Oh, right. Oh, and after Scruton was fired, this was the craziest thing of all. He put a picture of himself on, I think it was Instagram or Twitter, where he was drinking a bottle of champagne out of the bottle, and said the feeling you get when Roger Scruton is fired or whatever. And then he took that down, of course. But this guy is still a journalist, someone who was found to be lying in that blatant a way. So I can't even get my head around that either. This
is why journalism has a trustworthiness problem.
Yeah.
Because more and more people can see that it has become a hive of activists. Yep. It is a place where people go to because they know now in the information age and the power that you wield, journalists probably wield more power than they ever have before to influence people because of really in combination with social media. A story can go global that quickly.
Yeah.
And once it's out there, the damage is done. You really just need to get that first big hit in, and that's all you need to do. And so it has attracted people who definitely view it. Look, there was an incident here in New Zealand. And by the way, before I talk about that, if you know anything about Roger Scruton, you'll know that he's just such a mild-mannered and charitable person. Even when he discusses controversial issues, he's what I would call quintessentially English.
Yeah.
He's not a firebrand. He's not like if anyone likes Stephen Crowder, he's not like a Stephen Crowder. He's not a provocateur, not even close. And he's very intellectual. He's an academic, very, very scholarly man. And even controversial issues, he talks about them in such a measured,
Yeah.
quiet. So you just knew something was amiss straight away with the claims that were being made. But yeah, we had an incident here in New Zealand where just this year, 2020, our parliament passed one of the most extreme abortion laws in the world, struck down our existing law, passed a very extreme law that allows abortion up to birth, in fact, including during birth, if you could find an abortionist to carry it out for you. Pretty serious stuff. But there was a document that was written at about, I think it was end of 2008, around 2009. A group of people went over from New Zealand to Victoria in Australia, where they had implemented a similar law. Our law is even more extreme than theirs, though. But they went there in 2008 and they surveyed people on the ground to find out how they managed to get this law across the line. They wrote a report, and it was basically a guidebook, a roadmap to abortion decriminalisation, I think they called the document, and it was circulated around activist circles in New Zealand about how they could use these techniques to get the law across the line in New Zealand as well. One of the things they talk about in that document is that they need to get people into the media to put their spin on the issue. So they need to get journalists, not just people speaking to the media. They need to get, and that's exactly what you saw happening. And around the passing and the passage of that law, there was so much dishonesty, and you could clearly see. Look, I worked with someone who had a journalist. So this is a woman who is opposed to this law. And she has had her own abortion years ago and now runs a special group for women who want to memorialise their aborted children as well. And it's called the Buttons Project. They send in a little button to memorialise their unborn children who were lost to abortion. So that's who she is. She's not an activist who's on the front line. She doesn't do what you would call perhaps that more sort of in-your-face activism. That's her contribution. And you've got a journalist who turned on her during an interview and attacked her because she talked about when she lost her unborn child to abortion, and she got really angry with her for talking that way. Now, that tells you that you're dealing with an activist, not a journalist, not someone who's willing to be objective. And that's what we're seeing more of. And that's why you see that kind of incident with Roger Scruton. And you've got these people who clearly have recognized very cleverly. And by the way, this is interesting because you hear a lot of talk today about cultural Marxism. And this is something that particularly the cultural Marxists were very aware of. The Frankfurt School in particular were very interested in the idea of how media, in their day, they were really focusing on radio because that was the big popular medium. And so they considered media to be this thing which dulled the masses and kept them back from revolution and evolving to a better state of society. So they were very focused on how do we actually use media and how do we get media to start changing the narrative and culture. And that's really what you see happening here. There's an outworking all these decades later of that, and a lot of activists now do this kind of thing. And it's just, look, there's so many stories now. It just happens so regularly. That's why I say to people, don't trust a journalist unless you know them as a friend outside of the journalism and you know they're a person of good character. If they tell you, I'm going to run this particular story on this angle, don't ever believe it. Because I guarantee you that's probably not the full story.
Well, it's really dangerous because most people are not like Roger Scruton, where they're in a position to have all these defenders. Like Nick Sandman, whatever, was not in a position to have all these defenders, but at least he sued, which is basically your only recourse if, you're canceled or smeared or you lose your job or something because of something like this. But so I was the next question has to do with that, so there's the issue of free speech, and free press and cancel culture, for lack of a better word. So this summer we saw this, the Harper's letter, which was journalists and academics and authors and scholars calling for sort of this to end, where this sort of culture of, of like mob mentality, and calling to cancel people whose views you disagree with. And so I guess there's some people who dispute that that's actually happening. I don't think so, but it seems rather obvious. But It's okay. So, but the fact that journalists, that anyone, it's not just journalists, of course, that are calling to cancel people, but the fact that a journalist of any kind should be calling, for censorship of others or for canceling others is completely absurd, because they themselves rely on the same principle of free speech to be able to write.
Yeah, I think they absolutely do, and you've hit the nail on the head there. I think another factor too is that there's a lot of people who would put themselves in the perhaps secular progressive camp, or even the secularist camp. Now, this is not about people who say, "Well, I'm an agnostic and I'm an atheist." The genuine people who are sort of genuine searchers of truth, who say, "I'm not sure," or "This is where I fall." I'm talking about people who would say, who sort of elevate secularism as if it's a sort of values neutral, objective position to hold, whereas those religious people or those conservative people, they are values positive and they hold ideological positions. Everyone does. And the great lie is people think that I'm neutral or I don't, or I'm objective. Your thinking and your view of the world has been shaped by philosophy or ideology, whether you know it or not.
That's true.
And that's a real danger here. And I think a lot of them genuinely, again, that problem I was talking about before, they think that they're not just the center, but they think that they're objective. They think this is how the world should be. And therefore, when you start thinking like that, what happens very quickly is you think, well, anyone who disagrees with me, they must be, well, now they're literally Hitler, right? Everyone is Hitler who disagrees with you. And you can see how that happens. You think these people are dangerous because, I believe this is what the brave new world is supposed to look like. And you see in journalism that outworking of that. Like I said earlier, that this is where you get your activists who are very attuned to the fact that journalism is a platform. That this is, in many ways, it is the new preacher's pulpit, and it's become a bully pulpit for a lot of people. It's the way that you can preach to the masses. People used to go to churches and synagogues and temples, and they would hear about reality and morality and the world, and they would be called and challenged to think and act certain ways there. Not so many people do that anymore. Now this is the sort of the secular pulpit, if you like, is television, and not just news media, but now also very much increasingly the entertainment content that people are consuming. It's crafted to try and make them think a certain way about the world as well.
No, I agree with that. But to come back to what you said about, we were talking about humility before, but I mean, just the hubris that you have to think that to call for censorship. I mean, if you're saying that, you're basically saying my worldview, my convictions are infallible. Do you know what I mean? I am so convinced that I am right, that I am willing for, for this person to be fired for holding a different opinion or something like that. And
like if you think about it, if that other person was literally saying, I want to write an op-ed, or I believe that Jews are an inferior race and we need racial hygiene laws. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That has no place. That is a propagation and a promotion of an absolute objective evil. But if a person's going to disagree with you on the morality of abortion or same-sex marriage or their view of race, critical race theory, or there's so many, you pick an issue.
Yeah.
That does not make them an evil person. And quite frankly, like you say, there's this frightening idea that people have that it's not just that they're infallible, but they don't realize that they're not infallible. Yeah. And there's been some fascinating research about this, apparently, where we all have blind spots. Yeah. But the frightening thing is most of us don't realize we have them. I now, since reading about that research, I now more and more try and constantly remind myself, Brendan, you have blind spots. And if I don't do that, then I am prone to those sort of excesses. Yeah. But most people don't realize they've got them. Yeah.
Well, it's very like I've done some videos about having a Socratic outlook or Socratic temperament, which means that you question your own beliefs, right? Yeah. So just to think that you have all the answers is incredibly anti-Socratic. And but back to what I was saying before is that if you are calling for censorship or canceling, you can expect to become a victim of it yourself. And the reason of that is because opinions are constantly changing. Even 5-10 years ago, people's opinions on various subjects were vastly different than they are now, right? So, I mean, it's very possible that in the near future, opinions will shift one way or another, and that it will then be you who someone is calling to cancel, So, I mean, anyone in journalism should not be calling for censorship or cancellation of any kind.
Well, this is the thing, it's the old adage from the old Niemöller poem, the German U-boat captain who wrote that famous poem, first they came for the communists and I didn't speak up, then they came for the Jews, and finally they came for me and there was no one left to speak up for me. And that's the reality of it. But this is the great deception of it all. Yeah. You don't realize that they will come for you when you're doing this. It's just not something that people register. They don't, for whatever reason, they fail to understand how this is like a tiger. You feed the tiger and it grows and it wants more food. It doesn't stop. It's never satiated. And we're now starting to see more and more of this. Look, this is a massive, bigger issue around the question of what is happening with the West in general. My personal view of things are that the West is at the end stage of whatever was the West. I don't know what that means for what comes next, but I think there is a collapse I don't think there's a collapse that could happen. It's not. I think the collapse has happened, and that's why we're seeing so many of these manifestations of these problems. The society, the basic fabric has just gone. And but the point is that people don't realize. They look at it and they think it'll always be the way it is. It'll just be this narrow window. It'll only be these people we're cancelling or getting rid of. And like you say, very quickly, though, what happens is another group comes along and says, well, you're not quite ideologically pure enough for me either. You've got to go too.
Yes. Well, this is why we have the principle of free speech, because it's objective. For the most part, it's with very few exceptions, at least in the U.S., you cannot go to jail for saying things, except for there are very few exceptions to that, like yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? But if you do, even really like aberrant stuff, like you just said, about like Holocaust or whatever, But yeah, that's why there was this more or less objective standard. Whereas if you do away with that, it's a free for all, because then everything becomes more subjective. Where if you have this legal and philosophical standard of free speech, it's harder for speech to be criminalized.
Well, I think it's interesting too when you talk about free speech. There's a presentation that I give on this issue, and more and more I've been asked to present on this topic. And that shows you more and more people are getting concerned about what's going on. But one of the things I say is that people often, when they think about free speech, the right to free speech, they frame it in terms of the right of the speaker. What they forget, though, is that it's also about the rights of the hearer to actually hear all of the information and to have their own journey towards truth. And they can't have that if they are prohibited from all of the information. Now, that's not an argument to say you should be able to say anything you like, but it is an argument, I think, to say that you need to be very, very, very careful when you start saying, well, we're going to limit what people can say, because the moment you do that, you are setting yourself up, like you say, you're setting yourself up as an arbiter of what is true and what is good. Yeah. And you need to be real careful at that point. Real careful.
Yeah, absolutely. But, so I don't think we've touched that much on the issue of ad money or advertising money in sort of corporate media. So, so I know that there are some, newspapers or, journalistic outlets that don't really allow their their advertisers to dictate, what they will and will not publish. But some obviously do. But so, for example, in the United States, you almost never hear stories with an anti-pharmaceutical spin. You know what I mean? Even in cases where it's really necessary. Like you don't hear a lot of things, for example, that are really critical of pharmaceuticals or a certain drug or whatever. And I believe that they're one of the biggest advertisers. So, I mean, how much do you think that the whole issue of sort of advertising and ad revenue plays into what is talked about in journalism?
Well, I think it would be a complete denial of reality and of how human nature works to think that if you ran an organization and it was being funded by, the advertising revenue from different groups who put major amounts of money into your business and kept it propped up and kept you earning a living and paying your staff, I think it would be extremely naive to think that those organizations have no pulling power or no controlling stake. I think that's just, look, that's probably what you might call a libertarian fantasy, I think. Everyone's just in their own little bubble making their own little choices and no one's affected by anything else. That's not the real world. Look, I run a charitable organization and I regularly consider and I think about the some of the biggest supporters of my organization. Before I make certain big decisions, I do think about, well, what do I think is being, if you like, faithful to what they would expect of this organization they're supporting so heartily. And so you can't help but have that going on, even if you pledge not to. I think we've got examples where you can see so often where money is just a corrupting factor. But there's another layer to this as well. Yeah. And that other layer is when you are in a social media driven revenue model. Yeah. Because it's one thing to say, well, no pharmaceutical company is going to dictate to me the stories I tell. But what that also depends on is you having such a strong revenue earning model that even if they were to pull out, other people would still want to put their advertising dollar with you because they know that by advertising with you, their product is going to be seen by millions and millions of people. Yeah. So the real problem, I think, is the way in which social media now is the way of generating those millions and millions of eyes. Yeah. And what that does is, in that scenario, to keep those eyes and to keep viewers and to get clicks on social media, you really have to get into the process of clickbait and rushing content and all that kind of stuff we were talking about before to keep that revenue model thriving. Yeah. It's interesting how some journalistic outfits now and some media are starting to move towards putting things at least partially or fully behind a paywall. That's what should have happened with the advent of internet and social media, but they didn't think it through. For whatever reason, I don't know why, they didn't sit and just forecast what would be the outcome of trying to make everything free. Yeah. And I think if they'd got people used to the idea right from the very beginning, you still have to pay something for news, then I think we'd be in a better place than we are now, I think, in that regard. But so many of them now depend on that click-based revenue. They don't really care. They need you. And I sense also from my conversations with different journalists, it's almost like the media has now become two separate things that are very powerful. You've got journalists, so the newsroom, and then you've got the advertising room. Yeah. And that it's funny, it's like a two-headed beast. And it's the goals and aims of the advertising room in a strong capitalist-based economy like this. They're completely at odds, I would argue, often with and they don't really serve well the aims of a newsroom, which is supposed to be about telling the truth no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough.
Mm. But look, it's a bigger question because there is like behind everything, there's always these bigger. I've already talked about the fact that the loss of traditional Western culture and values and what does the implications there. And by the way, I'm not talking about a whiteness thing here. Some people wrongly hear that and they think, oh, you're talking about white people. No, look. I think it was Hilaire Belloc who once said that the tradition is Europe, but Europe is not the tradition. Yeah. So it's big and deeper than that. So you've talked about Socrates as part of that, Aristotle's part of that, and so that we've had that the loss of that affects journalism, the institutions within the culture. But I would argue so does the way we do economics. Now, I am by no means interested in socialism or communism or anything like that, but there's also no denying that there are some major failings within capitalism that are creating problems, and that is going to have an effect as well. Like globalization and the drive to make money that way, that has an impact on news and the way. Even think about here in New Zealand. Right now, we're a small island nation that has got nothing to do with America. Yet we are being saturated with almost wall-to-wall coverage now in our news media, local news media, of the American election, as if it's momentous for us. Now, it is important because it's the biggest nation in the world, but the way it's being talked about, it's really, as I said, it's being driven by a view of, I think of it, an economic philosophy, a way of making money. There's so much feeding into this. It's not just about what's necessarily happening in that newsroom or in the mind of an individual journalist, if you like.
Yeah, that must be really annoying to have to hear, because I never hear anything about New Zealand. Well, with very few exceptions. I knew that there were not a lot of coronavirus cases, and I did hear about that abortion law that was passed back in the winter. I did see that. Yeah, in years past, I made it a point to watch almost no news at all, actually, because I found that it disturbed my equanimity. But
that's a very prudent thing.
Yeah, well, but this year I felt like I had absolutely no choice and now I've become kind of a news junkie, at least, because it's just been insane, all the things that have happened this year. So I'd hopefully after the election I'd go back to not watching it, but that's why I've heard all these things that you're referring to, because normally I would be living under a rock and not aware of many of them.
That's a smart approach, I should say. That is a smart approach for journalism.
Well, I've even written about that, about how there's nothing to be gained by watching the news most of the time.
Nope.
Yeah.
No, I've sort of tuned out, really. I used to have notifications, the different news apps here in New Zealand. I'd have the breaking news notification. I turned those off some months ago. I pretty quickly realized that breaking news was just whatever they wanted you to click on. It didn't have to be breaking or important.
Yeah.
And then I turned them off, and I realized, I don't miss it, and I didn't look. If something truly catastrophic is happening in the world,
you'll hear about it.
I will find out. Yeah. Someone will message and say, "Did you hear about?" Or, "Do you know what's going on?" Or And what I'll do is probably once a day I might go and check the news websites, or if there's a particular issue I need to be on top of, then I'll start following it. But other than that, no.
Yeah. Well, I get all these emails about various things, so I'll have to unsubscribe from some of them eventually, but... Well, let's talk about solutions. So what can any of us do about this stuff? About the, decline of journalistic ethics and poor quality media, and also how can we find and support quality publications or independent journalists?
Yeah, look, I think there's a fascinating. That's a great question, and there's a fascinating sort of factor or array of factors here, and I think you almost got to split this into two parts. There's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and then there's the fence at the top. How do you do both? I think the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff is right. Let's find and support good, probably independent media ventures, we're seeing more of them. Tim Pool's, Tim Staples, another one. Is it not Tim Staples? I can't remember the guy. Staples. There's these journalists who are starting to crop up who are. Is Ian Miles Chong's another one who have shown that they're willing to tell the truth no matter what and regardless of their politics. So I think supporting people like that. I think the work that Shapiro's doing is pretty good. I mean, at times that they put their bias on their sleeve. Crowder is not really a news source. Stephen Crowder, he's you really watch him if you're a conservative looking for entertainment or commentary. But any sort of source that's going to show itself to sort of be willing to challenge the establishment in an appropriate way, then and is independent. I think read, watch, and support. I think that's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. There's a bigger question though, and that's how do we look at the fence at the top of the cliff? And I think that speaks to the sort of the decline in culture. And I think there's a much bigger question. I think what we've got to get back to, I think, is really a model where we think and act local. So you hear a lot about, think global, act local. I say think and act local, because that's the only way you can really form meaningful friendships and relationships with people, is the people around you. It's the only way to find meaningful connection with others, through local community. And so I would argue that our news as well should really be relevant to where we are and who we are. And so much of what we consume is not. It's relevant to things that they're just not relevant. And then also there's the factor of, how do I strip away what is trivial in my life? So much time is wasted and lost from our lives, and the triviality of getting caught up in salacious gossip and that passes itself off as news media. So how do I strip back and bring back a bit more depth to my life? Reading books and spending time with others, and actually going to a pub and conversing with people, those kind of things. And I think those are the things that will help to safeguard us. I think one big thing too, though, is there needs to be accountability. So, like, Nick Sandman taking legal action is important, I think, and particularly in America. Like, obviously, your culture is a lot more litigious than we are. We don't have that traditional culture where you sue for various things. It's not as common to hear people doing that in New Zealand. We're very English in that regard. But in a culture like yours, that's a tool, and I think that's got to be. People have got to utilize that to protect and to bring accountability. In my country, we have a broadcasting standards authority, and you can complain to them if you believe that journalism is not being represented accurately and fairly. I think we've got to pursue that. And I think one thing that people who have a sort of a passion for independent, like, content creation, and they care about these issues, I would say one thing they can do if they're not a journalist is to create content that scrutinizes mainstream media content and puts the spotlight on it. Because, like I said, they don't like the idea of being thought of as lacking bias. And if people can actually say, hey, we're going to try and hold them to account, I think that's an important part of this as well.
Yeah, that's great. I don't think that I have much to add to that. So it looks like we are reaching the end of our interview. So
wow, that was good.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, this was great.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. Well, very good. Thank you, Brennan. Do you want to plug your channel one last time before we wrap up here?
Yeah, if people want to follow me, they can do that at Left Foot Media on YouTube. So you can find that by opening your browser and going to www.watchlfm, Left Foot Media, lfm.com, watchlfm.com. I've also got my Monday Night Live interview show that I mentioned earlier on, and you can find that at mondaynightliveshow.com. And that's different. It's interviews with people talking about sort of long-form interviews about sort of bigger issues or interesting issues.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks so much, Lee.